Policy lessons from South Korea's development. Productivity as the driver of growth in a mature industrial economy with Barry Eichengreen.
I'm Barry Eichengreen from the University of California. When I teach my Cal students about the Korean economy, about modern economic growth, and about the productivity problem, I typically start with this picture of Seoul in the early 1950s and in 2016, which very visibly illustrates how the Korean economy has changed over the course of those 65 years. How did it affect that change? Through a combination of two things. Number one, capital accumulation. Again, you can visibly see in the picture how much capital accumulation has occurred in Korea over the intervening period. But number two, and equally important, productivity growth. Robert Solow of MIT famously found for the United States that productivity growth accounted for the majority of economic growth in this country over the course of the 20th century. Late developing economies like Korea in the second half of the 20th century and China in the 21st are different in that they start out with very little capital equipment, very little in the way of modern structures, very little in the way of infrastructure. So they grow through a combination of high savings and investment, capital accumulation on the one hand, and productivity growth on the other. Over the course of that development, they build their capital stock up to normal levels. So they have to come to rely more on total factor productivity growth in order to maintain the growth process. They have to move from growth via perspiration to growth through inspiration. They have to move from accumulation to innovation. So the productivity problem becomes absolutely key. The other important thing that happens in the course of economic development is that the sectoral structure of the economy changes as workers, resources more generally, are reallocated from agriculture to industry and eventually to services. Korea saw that over the course of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, now to the point where the service sector accounts for about 75% of employment in the Korean economy. That poses a challenge. Economies in general, Asian economies in particular, and South Korea very specifically have a problem of boosting productivity in the service sector. So we design iPhones here, you design Samsung phones in Korea. I have a Samsung because the phone is equally good and it can be produced in Korea competitively at a competitive price. The problem in Korea is the problem of boosting productivity in the service sector in particular, where output per worker is only about 60% what it is in the service sector in the United States. So one interpretation of this problem is it's intrinsically more difficult to raise productivity in services than it is in manufacturing. In manufacturing, you can add more equipment, you can add robots. In services, on the other hand, 100 years ago, it took 4 people an hour apiece to play an hour-long string quartet. Now it still takes 4 musicians an hour apiece to play an hour-long string quartet. So it may be that we just don't know how to raise productivity in services as effectively as we do in manufacturing. Personally, my view is that we are effectively addressing that problem, that we figured out how to add ATM machines to banking. We figured out how to more efficiently utilize electronic medical records in healthcare, that we will raise productivity growth over time, and we have succeeded in doing that in the provision of medical services, in the provision of financial services, in retail and commercial activities, but much more so in the U.S. than in Korea, which is a country where these processes lag behind. Korea is competitive in services internationally only in a very few subsectors. There's K-pop, there's air transportation, where Incheon is a commercially viable, competitive hub, but not so much in financial services, not so much in tourism, hotels and restaurants, not so much in medical care. And it's not clear why Thailand should be an international center for medical tourism, but not Korea. I think the problem that Korea has had is, number one, overregulation of the service sector. There are all kinds of impediments to big box stores moving into retail and commercial activities in smaller towns where they will crowd out the mom and pop store. In addition to that, the service sector in Korea has become kind of a catch basin where older workers separated from big firms go to be underemployed in the family store or cigarette stand before they transition to retirement. Korea, therefore, needs to reform these policies over time in order to raise productivity in services, which accounts, as I said before, for 75% of employment, in order to boost productivity and living standards toward United States levels. What can it do specifically? Number one, I think it can lighten regulation on the big firms, which are still unrepresented in the service sector. Number two, it can further develop its pension and retirement system so that resistance to competition for the corner store and family cigarette stand becomes politically viable in the country. I think if it does those things, it will be feasible over time for the service sector in Korea to transition in the direction of more large, high productivity firms, which is what happened with the chaebol and manufacturing over previous decades. What then can countries do to boost productivity growth? Korea's own history, it seems to me, points to two important elements. Number one, investing in education, where the country has done very well. Almost everyone in Korea now graduates from university, and most people graduate from good universities. Number two, encourage new firm formation, encourage entry. And there I think Korea has done less well. Here in California, close to Silicon Valley, we are famous for startups, which are organized by entrepreneurs with venture capital funding. Korea is trying to move down that road as well, but I think it has done less well, which is part of the explanation why levels of productivity continue to lag those in the United States, and why productivity has become a problem for the service sector in particular, where the vast majority of new employment creation will be concentrated. Finally, third thing that can be done in Korea to boost productivity in the service sector is to reorganize along more efficient lines the big public institutions that are important for service sector delivery. So here I have in mind universities, hospitals, a variety of other related public sector activities where unionized workers are powerful and sometimes resist fundamental efficiency-enhancing change. That's a place where the public and the politicians need to step up and remind everyone of the common good. I think that kind of reorganization is needed as well to boost service sector productivity, both in Korea and in the United States.